Thank you, Dr. Crowell. That was an awesome introduction to the public policy issues that we've been talking about this morning. And vis-a-vis that topic, I'd like to begin with Dr. Carl White. And Carl, very quickly, if you could perhaps address that topic that came from the audience about the bottleneck issue that we have in our country and relate it to the early intervention system that you are so involved in.
Thanks, Donna, and thanks to you, Professor Crowell, for helping me understand how butterflies lead to science that leads to better practices. So I'll never look at butterflies again in quite the same way. So I think there are two issues here about where and why we need to send this message about why earlier is better. Obviously, the people that we need to convince most are the parents and the physicians and the early intervention providers so that we can eliminate the bottleneck in that system that was referred to sooner or earlier. I think one of the issues is that we lose our focus a little bit. I recently did a horseback ride with my grandchildren in Bryce National Canyon. And at the beginning of that horseback ride, every arch, every hoodoo, it was just amazing. You were just stunned. But by the end of 4 hours, you kind of said, oh yeah, another hoodoo, another golden arch. And so we allow people to confuse the importance of hearing and communication, the importance of listening and communication. People, because they're so accustomed to hearing well, they don't understand what happens with other people who don't hear well. But they do understand communication if we make it clear to them that this is the basis of connection to other people. And I think all of us in this room have a role to play in that. Helen Keller once said that the tiny pushes of each individual person are just as important as the massive shoves of the heroes in our field. And I think we sometimes defer to the heroes who have great data, but we don't translate that data to those that really matter, to the parents and the physicians and the early intervention providers. And we have to do a better job of helping those on the front lines understand the butterflies that Professor Crowell talked about, and to always bring it back to their attention that if we don't have this hearing ability, this listening ability, then the communication ability is going to disappear as well. So thank you for helping me to think about it differently than I have before.
Thank you. Let's move on to Maura Burtz, and Maura is the director of Listen and Talk in Seattle area. It's a specialized listening and spoken language program for families and their children with hearing loss, including birth to 3 and preschool ages. And Maura, can you tell us, when families show up at Listen and Talk, what are they looking for, and what have they been told about their child's best opportunity for learning language?
Okay. Thank you, Donna, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation here with colleagues that I've admired and respected for some time. To give a little context, Listen and Talk is in the Seattle area, and the system there is includes 3 different programs for young children who are deaf or hard of hearing in their families: an ASL English bilingual program, a simultaneous communication program using signing exact English, and listening and spoken language, which is Listen and Talk. Counties contract with these provider agencies, and within those contracts, families with children who are deaf, hard of hearing, the coordinators are required to introduce those families to all 3 agencies. So when a family comes to Listen and Talk to meet us, or in whatever form that is, they know that they're going to be making a choice. They're interested in, how is this going to work for my child who is deaf if you're not using a visual language? they have gotten information from family members, from friends, including the neighbor of a grandmother who knew this guy named Jace Wolf. And so a family showed up with some really lovely information and understanding of what a listening and spoken language approach was about. But YouTube, social media, and so many of these messages are conflicting with each other. In one message, a program like Listen and Talk is the best thing you can do for your child, and in another message, a program like Listen and Talk is going to destroy your child's future. So they come to us, they're tired, they're worried, they have young children, and within all of that, they're very driven to make a decision that is best for their child. They want their child to be happy. They want their child to be successful, no matter what that definition of success looks like for them. And because that information that they have gathered may or may not be accurate, our team really focuses on the evidence, the talking about their values, their outcomes, what does family life look like, and then we're able to explain how listening strategies, auditory strategies, can build that language of the home and heart and lead to the outcomes that they're looking for.
So just coming back to you more, do you think that the state of Washington perhaps is further ahead than some states in ensuring that families have that information early on?
I would love to say yes, but Washington State loves local control, so what's happening in King, Pierce, and Snohomish counties may not be happening in Whatcom County, may not be happening in Clark County. So I think the inconsistencies within the system definitely present barriers and burdens for families.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable thing to say, and Carl mentioned that point of locality being a key factor on an earlier panel today. So on to Jace Wolf. Jace is an audiologist who has worked with families and children with hearing loss for 25 years, and first with Hearts for Hearing in Oklahoma City, and now as Senior Vice President for Innovation at the Oberkotter Foundation. Dr. Krall's lectures showed the potential consequences of auditory deprivation on brain development, and we know that auditory deprivation leads to deficits in listening and spoken language abilities. What are some other consequences, do you think, of auditory deprivation that are important for parents and professionals to consider?
Thank you, Donna. That's a great question. I love the fact, Dr. Krall, that over the last 10 years or so, you have really focused on the cascading effects that hearing loss has on brain development. He has an excellent paper. He's moved from cats to rats because rats are easier to train than cats, which I think says a lot about cats. But in rats, the last I checked, rats don't have spoken language. But in these rats with congenital hearing loss, he showed that they had detriments in the development of their executive function and their social pragmatics, how they interacted with other rats. And there's been a lot of debate over the years that maybe that's related to language rather than auditory deprivation. But these rats, there's no language involved. So you can directly show that auditory deprivation leads to deficits in higher order abilities, even deficits in the development of the prefrontal cortex, which he also showed with his studies in rats. But beyond that, I really feel like a cornerstone of our discussion for the impacts of auditory development on children with hearing loss really should center around literacy development. And we've known historically over 40 years where literacy development has been measured in children in residential schools, that upon graduation, most read somewhere between a 2nd to 4th grade level. And keep in mind that that is in spite of the fact that it costs about $125,000 per student per year for an education in a residential school. And there have been a number of different research efforts to try to develop new abilities to teach people, children who communicate through sign language, who have auditory deprivation, how to read. And one thing I love about Dr. Krall's research, and he mentioned Taylor Swift, I told him Wednesday night, Dr. Krall to me is like Taylor Swift to my daughters. If he lived in North America, he'd have to get a restraining order against me because I'm fascinated with his research. I think it's so critically important. I would follow him around all the time just asking questions and telling him how awesome his research is. But if you're familiar with his research, he shows in cats with auditory deprivation that there's a decoupling between primary and secondary auditory cortex. What do we know about those two areas of the brain from functional neuroimaging studies? Primary auditory cortex processes the acoustics of speech, intensity, spectral, and durational characteristics. Secondary auditory cortex processes phonemes. What do we have to have? What foundational abilities do we have to read? We have to have language abilities, and we have to have decoding abilities. We have to have phonemic awareness. The A says ah, the B says ba. If you can't develop that, no matter how hard you try, you'll never become a fluent reader. And we know that from studies with typically developing children. Back in the 80s in California, they tried to teach whole word reading instead of reading based on phonemic awareness or phonics, and it was a disaster. They abandoned the approach after spending tons of money on it after about 3 years. So why historically do children who are deaf read at a 2nd to 4th grade level? It's because they don't have phonemic awareness because of the decoupling between primary and secondary auditory cortex. And I thank you for presenting the smoking gun of where that occurs in the brain. And we've got to do everything we can to avoid deprivation to establish that link.
Thank you, Jason. I also love the fact that you brought that home to our listening language literacy campaign and the importance that all of this has to reading in children. And I think we probably have not emphasized that enough in any of our work. So let's come back to Dr. Krall. What aspects of your research do you think should be emphasized in capturing the opportunity of early hearing, and how have those of us involved in messaging and governmental processes to officials in government, how have we missed the point on this? What could we do?
Well, I'm not an expert in this kind of communication with the politicians. That's a difficult task, and I'm not sure if I know exactly what's the problem there. But what I wanted to make clear is that development of hearing is an interplay between the caregiver and the infant, and probably one issue, and it was already addressed, is the parent. The parent is a key element of all this. It's the element because we know from studies like from Angers and others that maternal sensitivity is a significant factor in outcomes of cochlear implantation. We know that socioeconomic status has an influence, and we know that children of low socioeconomic status families hear much less words over the years. So that's one important thing. And nowadays there is also, I have the feeling, that it's not a study, I have the feeling that there is a tendency to get the child in front of a tablet and to let it listen passively to something that is not really very helpful. And the parent is also important yesterday we talked about the follow-up. I think the parent is the link between the different clinical interventions and diagnosis measures, and it's on the parent to decide when to go to the next stage. So the parents are so critical. I mean, if we could educate the parents how to deal with a deaf child, how to interact with a deaf child, which is also different from a hearing child, and how important the hearing is, I think that would be a great thing. But I think we agree, hopefully, all on that.
Yeah, I really like the point of parent sensitivity, and very often it's maternal sensitivity. That's what
sorry for that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the work that they showed in the SEDACI study that John Naparco and others ran. They were part of their study came out of that. And you know, I really feel like those of us that have been in this field as long as I have, do you remember when we used to tell families who were not speaking English at home that if they wanted their child to get a cochlear implant, they had to speak English at home? And we don't do that anymore, but it went on for a good long time, and obviously interfered with this whole issue of interactions between the parent and the child. And perhaps, and I'd like this to be directed at all of you, we haven't discussed that sufficiently in early intervention, and the fact that the parents and their comfort with language is at the earliest possible age, and it's backed up by your research, hasn't been messaged.
Just a comment tying what you said, Donna, to what Mara said earlier when she said that I can't remember the exact sequence, but it was the cousin of the mother that knew Jace. And I think not only are parents the key, but the general public is the key. I can't help but think about the fact that every time I sit on an airplane and someone says, "And what do you do?" And I say, "I work in early identification of hearing loss with infants and young children." They say, "Oh, then you know sign language." And it's just an automatic response. We haven't done a good enough job of helping parents and grandmothers and neighbors understand what the potential of real communication is with deaf children, and that they have available to them every option that everyone else has if we start early and do it right. And so I think not only the parents, but all of their cousins and uncles and aunts need to hear this message. It's not the people in this room that need to hear it nearly as much, as fascinating as it was, and as much as it confirmed my existing biases and my experiential experiences. But we need to get that word out to all of the public that are making decisions about these things.
Donna, I'll add just a little bit to that. I would also say that in Washington, there's been incredible impact of the families approaching decision makers and being part of these policy conversations. You know, I've been at this long enough that, you know, the alums that were 3 years old when they left Listen and Talk are in their 20s and 30s, and they're amazing representatives of the power of an early start, early access to technology. And instead of me as a hearing professional, where it may look like I'm kind of fighting for job security, you know, this person can say, I have a fulfilling life. I am grateful for this. So I would encourage people to engage the families and, quite honestly, the children and young adults in the conversations with policymakers.
That's great. Jace, you had such an incredible base of knowledge and experience with families in Oklahoma, and now, of course, with families across the country. What do you think about this topic?
I think three things super quickly, and just to kind of springboard off your comment earlier about language first. There's also the narrative that's developed recently about language deprivation, and that's obviously a very important narrative. But language deprivation for the 95% of families who have parents with typical hearing, that's a downstream consequence of auditory deprivation. And so I think that needs to become the primary narrative, is the importance of auditory deprivation for the development of children with hearing loss. Also, I think when you look at what Dr. Krall presented today, he talked about Peter Huttenlocher's research on synaptogenesis and that it peaks at 9 months. And I think it's awesome that that provides an anatomical and physiological correlate to Kuhl and Worker's research that shows that at about 9 months, you start to become maximally sensitive to the phonemes of your native language. and you start to lose the ability to code phonemes for non-native languages. And so all that kind of converges to tell us that the brain has done a lot of work by 9 months. If we're implanting at 9 months, we're probably still a little too late. And so I think we need to work with families to advocate at 6 months so we can get in early and shape that brain as it's developing. And then finally, I would say another narrative is that there's this mystical variability that is associated with cochlear implant outcomes, that it's just kind of a random luck of the draw. Some kids do well, some kids don't. In reality, if you get a cochlear implant early and you wear it during all waking hours, it's programmed well, over 90% will do excellent. And I think that's something that families need to know to make an informed choice.
Those are great comments. And your note about 9 months being perhaps too late is something Dr. Kroll said to me yesterday when we chatted, that our 9-month FDA criteria is probably too high. Would you like to pick up on that point, Dr. Kroll?
Yeah, I guess FDA is driven by safety concerns, and that's good in many medical interventions. But I think in this domain, as far as I know, and Professor Lennart is maybe here in the audience. We are implanting, or they are implanting in Hanover children that are much younger than 9 months. So that's surgically feasible. I don't know if in all children or only in a subset, but it's well feasible and safe. Why not doing that? The surgeons have to say that. I'm not competent on that, but maybe that's too late. And regarding the language, I was surprised about that because we know that there is a language deprivation effect. We know it from the unfortunate children who were deprived of language but could hear, the feral children, wild children, as you know, from the literature, but that critical period lasts much longer than the first 3 years. So there seems to be a sequence, and language is not the critical period for language is not closing before the hearing, but it's the other way around. So I don't understand fully what they mean with language first.
Thank you. Anyone want to make a quick parting comment? Because we're getting to the end.
I'll say something quickly going back to our last panel discussion where they talked about the report that's being done by the Government Accounting Office, the GAO report. That report will be out in December, and I think it will be a very important report, and that some of those GAO reports languish and die because no one does anything with them. I think, depending on what's in it, but I'm optimistic that it's going to be a very solid report. Based on the data I've seen them collecting. And I think we as a group need to take that and bring it to the attention of our local legislators, of our federal legislators, of our policymakers. There will be some good information there, and it will be a missed opportunity if we don't build on that to focus on what happens when children get earlier implantation, earlier access to auditory sound, and early intervention.
Thank you. That's a great parting comment. And thank you very much to the panel and Dr. Kroll for a very inspiring keynote this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
We are most welcome.